Paul, and today I'm here to tell you all about the retreat that I just went on called Embodying Your Faith in a Secular World, although it's more so just the embodying the faith part. We didn't talk too much about the secular world. Before we continue, I just want to apologize in advance that I don't have any footage or pictures to show you because I forgot to bring a camera. Honestly, I'm kind of glad that I did though, because it did help me live far more in the moment and kind of enjoy the good stuff while it lasted. For those of you that met me on the retreat, I had a tradition where I like to write Facebook notes, but Facebook discontinued notes in 2020. So back when that was a thing, I would write about all of my experiences. And I was the type of person that I was pretty honest about what I was writing about. So I will be more than willing to talk about what I didn't like about the retreat. So if you're the type of person that gets easily offended, you probably don't want to watch this. Without further ado, the general theme that I took out of this retreat experience was a lot of little things added up to make big victories. Even just going on the retreat was such an amazing story, and I almost didn't go on it. So how I found out about it was I am currently in contact with the youth minister at my local parish to try to be a volunteer chaperone for the high school youth group. And one day we were talking and she said, "Hey Paul, there's this retreat and I think you'd really like it." So she gave me the information, but when I looked it up I was like, oh dear, that's quite the big price, so I don't think I'm going to be able to go. And I just thought, okay, well, that's a shame. I really could have used a retreat after the very mixed reception that was the Lenten Retreat in 2022. But then I saw her again when I joined an Alpha group. So I said, is there any chance that there are scholarship funds that'll help me be able to go on this retreat? And she said, yeah, I'll be able to help set you up with that. And give or take, about a week later, she emailed me back and said, guess what? You got a full scholarship to go on the retreat. And so I was like, this must be a sign from God that I'm meant to be there. But then the car that I was going to take started having trouble on Wednesday. The retreat was Friday, mind you. And my sister didn't want me using her car, so we just barely managed to get the car fixed the day before the retreat. So then the interesting thing that, again, almost made it so that I didn't go was that the place where we were at was considerably more north than where I live, so therefore there was more snow and more of a storm. So I thought I was going to be late. Thankfully I was early, so that wasn't too big of a deal. And then when I got to the retreat house, there were like multiple buildings, and I went into the wrong one. So I was walking all around looking for some kind of sign or some kind of person, and there was no one there. It was a really big labyrinthine place with a whole bunch of rooms, and so I started getting really worried. But then I saw a sign on the wall that says this place is for the RCIA retreat members only, and then it had a mini little agenda saying, okay, at this point we're going to have lunch at the Bethany House. And I said, Bethany House? That kind of sounds familiar. And then I remembered the email that I had been sent out saying, make sure you meet up in the Bethany House. So I said, well, maybe I should walk around and see if I can find something like that. So I finally did, and then I finally found myself in the right place. So when I used to write Facebook notes, I would always start out by describing my surroundings, because a lot of people said that they really liked the feeling of, even if they weren't there on the retreat with me, that they felt like they were, because I did such a good job of describing my surroundings. So we walked through a really long hallway with a whole bunch of rooms on either side. There were a lot of rooms that were designed like confessionals, which also doubled for spiritual direction on this particular retreat. There were a few restrooms. There was a room where the priest would put on the vestments for Mass. There was a nice little chapel area with very hard seats and very small kneelers. It was cozy. Like, it felt like everyone there wasn't sitting too far away from the altar. And we'll get into Mass later, but it was certainly an interesting experience. It had a big, giant mural above the altar that said something along the lines of Et sum resurrectio et vita, which I believe is Latin for I am the resurrection and the life. and it was depicting when Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb. And once we got to the main area, there was a table on the right-hand side that had a bunch of snacks, and then on the left-hand side, there were a group of couches set in a semicircle with a fireplace on the left that could be turned on and off. The fireplace didn't actually provide that much heat, but it still was a very cozy experience. One thing that I wish was more emphasized on this retreat was that not a whole lot of, actually none of the activities required us to be in this room. We were told we could go here during small groups, but no one did. There was also a staircase that was a little bit to the upper right of where the couches were that led up to another lounge area, but I never took advantage of it. I don't know why. I'm usually the type of person that likes exploring when I go on retreats, but for some odd reason I just didn't feel the urge to. If we're looking at the table with the snacks here and the lounge area to a hard left, then to a slight right was the main conference room where we had all the talks. There were a bunch of round tables, and Dawn, the woman that put on the retreat, she put up some like holy pictures throughout the place. There was a whiteboard in the upper right corner that said like, "Welcome to the retreat," and it had like the code for the building just in case some of us went for a walk and they locked the doors on us. And so there was a podium, and then there was a big projector screen where we'd see all of the various slides related to the talks. And most of the retreat was spent in this room. I sat at the same seat at the same table for every single talk. The only time I ever sat somewhere different was when we did small groups. And immediately I felt like there were significantly different vibes going into this, because I sat down at the table and the first thing I heard out of the mouths of the retreat leaders were, "Hey, we got some pizza. Do you want to have some?" Now, pizza's my favorite food, so initially I was like, oh boy, this is going to be great. But then I remembered that we were about to have Mass, and you're supposed to fast an hour before Holy Communion, so I was like, well, I appreciate the offer, but I probably shouldn't. And then a couple of people started flooding in, and, it was the usual pre-retreat jitters of like, okay, we wanted to socialize, but we were still feeling a bit shy around each other. But then one girl named Kiara, such an interesting name, I remembered it because it sounds like tiara, but with a K sound, and she sat down at the left-hand side of me, 2 seats away. And I was just really impressed off the bat by the fact that she didn't seem like she was reluctant to come and join me. Because, sometimes when I meet women that are approximately my age, they kind of have this, men have been jerks in the past, so therefore this man is possibly a jerk. I didn't pick up on any of those kinds of vibes from her. And in fact, we actually sat next to each other at every single talk. So I thought that that was a nice little touch. It's possible that she's also a similar personality type to mine, where she likes her routine and her structure, which is probably why we got along so well. And keep this girl in the back of your mind, because that is also going to be a theme of small victories leading up to a big moment. We had quite a lot of talks. I won't go in exact detail about the agenda bit by bit. I'll just go over the major highlights. So the talks were scheduled around worldly things, but in doing those worldly things, we were being more like God. So for example, one of the talks was about work, and how we as humans are the only creatures on earth that are capable of doing work. Sure, animals will do stuff like the beavers will build dens and the spiders will make webs, but that's not so much work as it is survival instincts, whereas we can do stuff like we can get jobs to help people. Now God, he worked when he created the whole earth, and then he rested on the Sabbath day. So there was another talk all about the Sabbath. So putting the two together, us working allows us to restore earth to its proper state. So the doctors will restore the body, the janitors will restore the clean without the mess. And so that's participating in the saving and creational aspects of God. And then relaxation is allowing us to allow our bodies to behave more efficiently when it comes time to actually do the work. There was a talk all about food, and that was drawing a lot of direct comparisons with a book I read last year called This Is My Body by Bishop Robert Barron, where he made a lot of points that one of the primary ways in which God would call his people was that he would use a meal. And so because we believe that the Eucharist, even though it takes the form of bread, has actually transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ, that he compared the Eucharist to both physical food and spiritual food and gave scriptural passages to both. Now keep in mind that most of these speeches were stuff that I already knew, but just recontextualized. And there were a few bits of information that were new to me just because the priest had a habit of saying, this is what sacred scripture says, but you're probably wondering what philosophy says. So he would use a lot of, if this logical principle applies, then therefore we can conclude this. So I think that's called a synergism, if this then that. And one of the things he said was, in order for us to appreciate heaven, heaven is going to have to be an enhancement of senses that we're already familiar with, because if heaven is this completely all new experience that we can't even fathom, we would have to be something different than what we already are. So therefore, whatever we experience in heaven is going to be in a manner that our current five senses can comprehend, just better. So like, we'll still be able to use our ears to hear the amazing melodies in heaven and to hear people talking, but we'll have better ears. And the music will be in such a way that, sure, our current brains can't comprehend how good it'll be, but by then God will upgrade us. And the communion of saints are looking forward to the day when there will be the resurrection of the body, which even the Protestant creed says that, by the way. And by then, it'll be even easier to truly appreciate why God made us man and woman. Going into small groups, this was hit or miss for me, because on one hand, we did have small groups on the Lenten Retreat in 2022, but I think it was 5 minutes long, and we were very exclusivist with our small groups. So our small group were the only people that we hung out with for the most part. And it felt like anyone else was kind of just an outsider. And my group on the previous retreat, really they only hung out with me because I was in their small group. Not because, oh, we think you're cool, Paul, but it's you're in our small group, so therefore you're cool. So not the best kind of mindset to have. This small group was more along the lines of, we were there to discuss, but we weren't exclusively talking with each other throughout the retreat. Now, of course, there's a rule of what is said in small group stays in small group, but it was nice to be able to reiterate stories and see things from a new perspective. Then we go into meals, because I'm trying to save the stuff in the chapel for last, because that was where it was really incredible. For meals, we went to a separate building, and this building was very similar to the cafeterias I had been in at previous retreats. The wood was a nice dark brown, and it had been snowing, so of course there was more of a somber atmosphere with the lighting from both interior and exterior. On the right side, immediately after walking into the room, there was a juice machine, and of course it had pop and coffee and tea and all that, but what I really liked about it was that they had orange juice and cranberry juice cocktail, which no, it wasn't alcoholic. And then we went to the left, and there was a buffet-style lunch bar where we could just pick and choose whatever we wanted. I was really impressed by the food at this retreat because I felt like I was always full after every meal, and the food was good. Nothing that I had tasted awful. It was all so good. I know a lot of people said that mission trip food was terrible, and while I'm not going to pretend it was perfect, this was significantly better than anything I had at Catholic Art Work Camp. What I really liked about lunchtime was that it felt like a significant victory, because the retreat leader wanted to make it so that it felt like a sort of silent retreat while not being entirely a silent retreat. So all throughout breakfast, we just sat in silence. But then every meal onward, we were in fellowship. And that same girl, Kiara, she spells her name with C-H. I sat with her for every meal, and I'm pretty sure that's significant because earlier in the day, after we had a little bit of a break after the first talk, I was feeling kind of nervous and kind of shy. I know I come across as an outgoing person, but usually that's after there's already been an established connection. So I walked up to her as she was refilling her water bottle, and I said, "Hey, I'm feeling a bit shy. Do you think you could introduce me to some people?" And so she walked me over to a couple of her friends. One of them was her coworker, Kenny, who then he later walked up to me and said, "Hey, I heard that you were a gamer," because the initial icebreaker was say something about your worldly desires that you really like. And he was like, "Oh, hey, I really love the GameCube, and I've been playing Ocarina of Time," so that was like a connection for us. We eventually ended up exchanging numbers, which I believe he was the only person I exchanged numbers with, so that was pretty cool. And the person that I ended up meeting, he ended up sitting next to me later on the retreat because the fireplace was on, and he started talking about like why he thought that humans thought fire was cool. And then one thing after another, it led to eventually me telling the story of how I got a miraculous healing. And to really prove that it was God's timing, we were on a time crunch. And by the time I finished my story about the miraculous healing, it was the exact right time for us to return to the conference room for the next talk. And then he approached me 2 more times after the retreat, and I got to tell him about my YouTube channel. I got to tell him even more stories of healing, and he just kept like shaking his head and smiling, saying like, "I can't believe that God did all this really cool stuff for you. This is so amazing." I think he followed my channel, but I think it was a different person by the same name, because when I looked at my recent subscribers, I was like, "Oh, hey, that person shares the same name." But then the videos on his channel, I was like, something tells me it's a different person, because that doesn't seem like the type of thing that this particular person's personality would do. So I want to briefly take a step back, not literally, because then I'd bump into the fireplace, toward the rooms, because I forgot to mention that when I was describing the exterior. So if we were looking at the fireplace area from the upper left, then at pretty much a direct parallel angle, if you're looking at a V shape, was the hallway leading into the rooms. Now, one thing I liked about this retreat in general was that there was no segregation between guys and girls whatsoever. Everything was co-ed. The only things that were even remotely separated were the rooms, obviously. But I don't even think there was like a specific female-only hallway, because there were 2 people that were married and they got to have a room together, obviously, which did not happen on other retreats I went on, except the I-916 Summit, where the married people had an entire floor to themselves, and the single people were all on another one. Anyway, so as I walked to my room, there was a drinking fountain on the right, and then there was also a table full of toiletries and amenities. And even though a lot of them were cheap, like 2-blade razors and a tiny little tube of shaving cream, it was something, which no other retreat I've been on did that. Like, if you forgot your toiletries at home, they'd be like, "Too bad, you're going without them." So when I went into my room, which was on the left, it was room 115. I was the only person in the room, even though it was a 2-bed setup. The one bed on the far side of the room looked like it could fit 2 people, but the one closer to the door only fit 1, which I thought was a weird design choice. There were 2 desks in the room. One of the desks had a chocolate bar on it, and the other one didn't. There was only a pencil in the drawer, which is weird, because I was like, at hotels, don't you normally have a Bible in the drawers? Oh wait, no, there was a Bible. It was the Catholic Youth Bible, and it was already on the desk. Beds were ridiculously comfortable. I had a wonderful sleep. There was also a bathroom directly across from the bed, and the bathroom actually had a towel to dry my hands with, which that was a huge victory. The shower was really small and really cramped, but it honestly didn't bother me, because I had such a wonderful shower that I kind of just didn't mind the crampedness. There was no shampoo, so that was a bit unfortunate, but they did have soap, so at least I had something. And I just overall had such a great sleep. I went to sleep around 10 o'clock, 10:30 both nights, because I had to wake up at like 7:30 to make sure we had enough time for morning prayer. So now let's get into the chapel stuff. Yes, now I've saved the best for last. So for those of you that aren't Catholic, priests, brothers, and religious sisters, which also includes nuns, have to pray what's called the Liturgy of the Hours. Now, lay people can pray them, it's just not a strict requirement. And what these are there's approximately 6 times a day where you have structured prayers that are typically like certain segments of scripture that are meant to like give off a certain vibe depending on the time of day. And over the course of about a year, they will eventually pray through all 150 Psalms during that time. And so there would be like morning prayer, evening prayer, Vespers. I don't know all of them because I don't really pray them, but I like it whenever I do. So we would do morning prayer, evening prayer, and night prayer. We didn't do Vespers. And this was really cool because it's designed to be almost like an echo chamber where one side of the room says certain verses and the other side says the other, and it was a very pleasant experience. One thing that wasn't so pleasant was that there weren't any like printed out sheets of paper that had the responses on them. So we were literally asked, take out your smartphones and download iBreviary. And I didn't have a smartphone, so I had to turn to one of the girls on my left, her name was Samantha, and like borrow her phone. But then eventually the retreat leader noticed that I didn't have a smartphone, and she let me borrow hers from then on, which was a bit of a learning curve because I didn't realize that I had to click on a hyperlink to go to another page. I thought you could just scroll down indefinitely, but it worked. So that was one of the cool experiences. We had Mass every day. Of course, Friday and Saturday they were weekday Masses, so they were significantly shorter. We didn't say the creed, and the homilies were kept really, really basic. So to give a perspective of how short the homilies were, on Friday the reading was about Jesus talking to the Jews during the Feast of Preparation. And so the priest explained that this was what the Jews call Hanukkah, where they were consecrating the temple to the Lord. And the fact that Jesus was equating himself with God during Hanukkah was essentially recontextualizing the old consecration, saying, I am fulfilling the needs that the temple originally provided. So in other words, he was saying that he was the fulfillment of the old law. And that was basically his entire homily, was just explaining that. Which, of course, your homilies are supposed to be shorter on a weekday Mass because people have things that they need to do. What I liked about the Masses were that the priest would do what's called ad orientem, which means oriented toward the tabernacle. He would only face the people when the responses were directly aimed toward the people, such as when he would say, like, the Lord be with you. Obviously, he's not saying the Lord be with you to the Lord. But, like, when he was praying prayers that were directed toward God, he would face the tabernacle, because that's where the leftover fragments of the Eucharist were from the previous Mass. So it felt more like the priest was joining us in praying to God, and so it put less focus on him and more on God. Now we get into Saturday reading, which is where I was able to read out the first reading and the the Psalms, because the Catholics have a reading from the Old Testament, then we sing a psalm, and then we read from one of Paul's letters, and then the gospel, but the gospel is always done by the priest. So I was grateful that I got to do the first reading. No. On a weekday Mass, you only do the Old Testament reading, so I got to do that. That was pretty cool. But then we get to Sunday's Mass. So since it was Palm Sunday, the tradition is you always read the passage where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. So that was all done in the conference room because the tradition is that you're supposed to do it outside the church and then process in, but because we were at a retreat center, we had to get creative. So the priest blessed the palm branches, and we each took one, and then we processed into the Mass, and then when it came time for the reading is always much longer on Palm Sunday. They have a reader, a speaker, the priest, and the people. And each part has like specific scripted lines to follow along with the gospel passage of Jesus doing the Passover, followed by the agony in the garden, followed by his crucifixion. I was able to be the narrator, which I felt so honored by because that's what I used to do with Stations of the Cross at my old parish, and I had a blast doing it. Except a couple of times some of the words were hard to pronounce because they were Hebrew, but it was otherwise just such an honor to be able to not be in the people role as I usually would be. I forgot to mention the homily that the priest did on Saturday, which was particularly cool. That was the day when the RCIA people, or now it's called OCA, Order of Christian Initiation for Adults, they joined us. So the responses from the people were significantly louder than usual. And the priest mentioned that since the homily is optional on a weekday mass, he just said, since you guys are all talked out from the retreats, we will just spend the next couple of minutes in silence asking for the Lord's presence. Okay, so now we get to the big part. So I mentioned that at Mission Trip, there was a combination of a little bit of adoration plus reconciliation plus being able to pray for each other. We didn't have the praying over each other part, but we had Eucharistic adoration plus the opportunity to go to reconciliation or spiritual direction. I was able to go to spiritual direction, trying to discern my vocation, and I thought that was pretty nice. I won't repeat anything that was said because a lot of it was like try to look for signs from the Lord, try to see what others have to say, that kind of stuff. And I didn't go to confession because I had just gone a couple of weeks ago and I was like pretty sure there are no major sins that I've done since then. But adoration was where it was really incredible. So for adoration, the exact second that the priest finished putting the Blessed Host in the monstrance and turned it toward the people, I felt this warmth in the pelvic region, a very satisfying type of comforting kind of warmth. And to put this into perspective, I've been going through pelvic floor therapy for the past couple of months. And what that basically means is that I've had this disorder where I am constantly feeling the urge to have to go to the bathroom way more than the average person does. But throughout that entire process, I did not have to go to the bathroom for 2.5 hours because that warmth just made me want to stay in my seat. Whereas like for some of the talks, I felt like I had to go during small groups. I literally had to say to my group, excuse me, I have to go. And it just felt so refreshing. And what made it even cooler was that when I was in the chapel, which is where the Blessed Sacrament was, the warmth remained. But when I left the room to go to spiritual direction, the warmth disappeared. But then when I returned to my seat, the warmth reappeared. Now, granted, it was only a temporary healing, as after I got back from the retreat, the problems seemed to reappear. But even a temporary healing is better than nothing. And most of the people on the retreat seemed pretty amazed by it. Right after that, we went right into having games, and one of the guys brought over this huge slice of like chocolate and vanilla pie. And he was like, you know what? It's Sunday, and Sundays don't count as the 40 days of Lent, so we should celebrate. And Paul had a miraculous healing, so we should celebrate even more. And I'm like, if no one else will, I might as well. I'm on a retreat. I should be able to splurge a little bit. So I forgot to mention a couple of things leading into the small victories leading up to a big victory. So remember that girl that I told you about, Kiara, the one that sat next to me at first, the one who also introduced me to someone? Well, we also sat together for every meal. And as I was going into lunch on, I believe it was Saturday, there were these two girls talking about going on a walk. And I said, oh, hey, is it okay if I join you on the walk? And they said, sure. But then when we were in the lunchroom, Kiara said that she wanted to go on a walk with her group and pray the rosary. But I was like, oh, man, I'm so glad that you guys are letting me go on the walk, but I already promised this other group that I'd go on a walk with them. So I wished them luck on their walk. And so there was a group of 4 girls and only me. So I used that as an example of saying I used to hate women before going on the mission trip. And God has obviously healed me because I wasn't scared or uncomfortable or uneasy. There was a lot of snow. Like where I live currently doesn't have any snow, but like I went farther north for this retreat and it did, so we were like crunching through the snow quite a lot. I didn't bring snow boots, but it didn't seem to be too much of a problem. There were a lot of pine trees above us, very pleasant type of experience. A couple of times we almost got lost and sort of wandered off past the boundaries of the retreat. But we still had a good time, and they seemed to enjoy my stories a lot. And then, as we were heading back, I said, you know what, guys, I'm feeling kind of tired, so I think I'll call it a day here and go back to the retreat center. But as I was walking back, Kiara and her group approached me and they said, hey, Paul, you want to join us for a walk? So it ended up being the very thing that I had wished to do in the first place. So I just ended up going on a walk with both people. And so overall, my thoughts on the retreat were, I do wish that there were a bit more fun activities. Like, the retreat wasn't boring. It had a lot of great spiritual moments, but there weren't a whole lot of, like, activities that were, like, joyful and providing laughter. It was more so of talks, prayer, more prayer, meals. Really, the only time that was fun was an optional moment at the end of Saturday night where people were allowed to bring games. And I was just like, I'm not much of a games person. I'm more of a, when the retreat is structured, I like to do it. I also felt like socializing was hit or miss. Like, most of the people I talked to seemed to really like me. But I felt like besides Kenny and to a certain extent Kiara and that guy that I talked to at the fire, it was pretty hard to feel like I could make a genuine connection. Like, the girls I went on a walk with, I feel like I connected with them pretty well. And Kiara and Kenny, I kept in touch with them. I think I kept in touch with 2 others. It was certainly a challenge being able to go into a retreat where I didn't know anyone really well. There were a couple of people that I recognized from the previous retreat, but I didn't know them super well because I didn't really make a whole lot of connections on that retreat. But I loved the comfort of my room and the couches. I loved the food. The food was phenomenal. Adoration was amazing. Spiritual direction was incredible. So in terms of spirituality, the retreat was pretty much perfect. In terms of the fun factor, that was pretty much non-existent. But it was still very Catholic, which the other retreat was. But it balanced it out a little bit more by having at least a little bit of an icebreaker, some small groups that were way longer than just a couple of minutes, no segregation between the genders, which the other retreat had a guys only and a girls only talk, so I was very grateful for that. I was even grateful that some of the talks talked about like marriage and sex, and they didn't even separate the genders, which normally that would do that on any other retreat, but they didn't here, so I was very thankful for that. Overall, I was very satisfied with the retreat. I thought that it answered a lot of my prayers, and I was very thankful that I had a temporary miraculous healing. I hope that the people on the retreat like my YouTube channel and maybe they like this, and if you weren't on the retreat, I would be very curious if my detail-oriented mind helped you to envision the retreat center more. I know obviously I can't do a perfect job of describing it, but I hope you'll feel like I described it enough where you can really get a general sense of the overall aesthetics. So with that, thank you very much for watching, my friends. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of the video. If you were on the retreat, I would love it if you would share your own stories, like what did you get out of the retreat, and if you're happy that we kept in touch. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat for supporting me. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!